I really love the prophetic literature in the Bible. Although it is very hard to choose, I do have a favorite prophet, and that's Jeremiah. I often turn specifically to Jeremiah 1 when I'm doubting myself, because Jeremiah did too, and God in this chapter reminds him of his vocation and of being destined for this task of prophecy before he's even born. The words of Jeremiah and those who came before and after him often buoy me in times when I am just feeling so angry and hopeless and despairing at the state of the world. And yet sometimes when I read these parts of the Bible, I think, wow, I really don't envy the work of the prophets. These people who preached fiery words to kings and occasionally performed deeds of power, these prophets were ultimately tasked with speaking uncomfortable truths and holding their communities accountable for the harms that they were perpetuating against each other. The prophets pointed out all the ways that their people had forgotten God and abused the poor and the widow. And that is not easy work. Not to mention the fact that God has very exacting standards for those who are called to be prophets. We read at the end of this passage from Deuteronomy that a prophet who presumes to speak in God's name a word that God has not commanded the prophet to speak, that prophet shall die. Mind you, I've had anxiety attacks preparing for performance reviews for jobs that I actually enjoy and that I know I'm good at. And death was not usually the potential outcome of those conversations with my supervisors. So I can't even begin to imagine the kinds of pressure those prophets were under. In our modern understanding, we talk about prophecy as the act of telling the future. Like when people quote Nostradamus and say that he predicted this tragedy or that. But in the biblical sense, prophecy is telling the truth, which sounds simple, but is an incredibly difficult act. In your own life, at some point or another, you've had to have had a conversation with someone, whether it's a partner or a friend, a parent, a work colleague, about something they've done that hurt you or offended you. And even if you phrase things in the most gentle terms, you don't know for sure how they're going to take it. They could express remorse and apologize, or they could become angry and defensive. There's also an additional fear that you could be punished for telling the truth. You could lose your job or your relationships with other people in your life. That's hard. A couple of years ago, I was doing an internship program, and towards the end, I ended up sharing some of my experiences along with other people of color dealing with or witnessing racism in our program. And I remember a lot of people calling me prophetic for doing so. They said things like, "You're so prophetic. Thank you for sharing this. That was such a word that you shared. That's so powerful. Thank you for your courage. Your story really helped my own understanding of this issue." Something about that bothered me. Not just because I don't consider myself a prophet at all, but also because I would hear all these nice things and then folks didn't take what I said seriously. Being vulnerable in that way is already hard enough. And seeing that my story and my recommendations and my frustration wasn't even being considered made what I was feeling that much worse. I've come to understand that if you're going to call someone a prophet, you must take their words to heart. People love to quote Dr. Martin Luther King when he was talking about love and peace and unity, but not so much when he spoke out against the evils of racism, militarism, capitalism, because that would involve taking a good, hard look at ourselves and at our societal involvement in all of these oppressive systems. That's because prophecy engenders accountability. Prophecy engenders responsibility. Prophecy demands change. Jesus knew this intimately. In our reading from Mark today, Jesus is out preaching and healing and is being described by witnesses as teaching with authority. The people of Capernaum are amazed by the things that Jesus is doing and what he has to say. But we also know, elsewhere in the Gospels, that Jesus was chased out of his hometown for doing the same things. We know that Jesus was often accused of being possessed by demons or of being a drunk. And we also know that in the end, so many of the people who were captivated by Jesus either deserted him or turned on him and had him executed. All because Jesus was calling his society to a different reality, calling them to love God and their neighbors, just as the prophets before him did. You can interpret this phrase, teaching with authority, in two ways. The first is that Jesus was the Son of God and was preaching from this position of divine authority. The second is that Jesus entered into our experience as a human fully, and he specifically spoke from the position of someone who was marginalized. He was a poor son of a carpenter from a rural town who was often experiencing homelessness and who was a colonial subject of the Roman Empire. So when Jesus taught us about things like paying your workers equitably, or pointed out the piety and righteousness of a widow giving everything she had to the temple treasury as an offering, these were not abstract images. These were things that he experienced or witnessed himself. And therefore, he had authority to teach on it. So what does it mean for the church to follow this Jesus who taught with authority and who often made just as many adversaries as he did friends? It means that we are also called to be a prophetic voice in our time and in our context, both individually and collectively as the church. Jesus calls us to speak the truth and do right by our neighbors. For example, when we see people mistreating or mocking our siblings who are struggling with addiction, we have an obligation to say, that person is a child of God who deserves love and respect. And we are called to advocate for their needs and better treatment. When we see white supremacy continuing to creep up in our national life, we are called to say that is not of God and stand against it. Speaking the truth is scary, and it may cost us power and prestige and comfort. But we cannot afford to forego this prophetic witness. We are not allowed to. It is what Jesus calls us to do each and every day. I'm going to leave you with the words of one of my other favorite prophets, Saint Oscar Romero, who was the Roman Catholic Archbishop of El Salvador in the 1970s. As some of you who may be watching this know, Archbishop Romero was assassinated for speaking the truth about the ways in which the poor in his country were being mistreated and murdered. He wrote, "The prophetic mission is a duty of God's people. So when I am told in a somewhat mocking tone that I think I am a prophet, I reply, God be praised. You ought to be one too. For every Christian, all God's people, every family must develop prophetic awareness, convey an awareness of God's mission in the world, bring it a divine presence that makes demands and rejections." May we all continue to step boldly into this prophetic duty every single day. Amen.